Hello, everyone. Welcome. All right, we'll go ahead and get started. Hi, everyone. My name is Julia Strong. I'm the Executive Director of Symbiosis Coalition. Welcome to today's webinar. We'll be talking about Symbiosis's recently released quality criteria, updated quality criteria, diving deeper into the science behind it, what's shaping the future of nature-based carbon removals. I will pull up my screen now, and we'll start with a presentation giving an overview of Symbiosis for those of you who aren't familiar with us and our work. We'll talk about that updated quality criteria, how it was developed, some of the updates around that before entering into our panel for today. So, to kick it off, who is Symbiosis? Symbiosis is a coalition of carbon buyers dedicated to catalyzing the next generation of high integrity, nature based carbon removal projects at scale. We have a commitment to purchase over 20 million tons of carbon removal under contract by 2030, sending a demand signal for high integrity nature based carbon removal projects, and following that with long term offtake agreements that are needed to unlock the financing for scale. We launched Symbiosis to address four key challenges that we saw. One, confusion about what good looks like, no universally accepted quality framework. Two, procurement teams who need carbon removal to complement their internal decarbonization efforts are bandwidth limited, don't have the resources to go deep on these projects, to have the in-house expertise to evaluate all different dimensions of these projects, which reduces the amount of time and effort that they can spend on these projects to get them under contract. Third, market uncertainty. Uncertainty about what demand will look like in the future keeps investors from investing, developers from developing projects, and buyers on the sidelines if they're not sure what good looks like. And third, lack of upfront financing. These projects need the capital to implement at scale. And without that certainty of demand from buyers who are struggling to purchase these projects, the investors can't support with the capital that's needed for scale. We also see that offtakes can really do for nature what power purchase agreements did for the renewable energy sector in terms of helping to provide the certainty of revenue and long-term demand that's needed to unlock institutional scale capital to help the climate and the planet get the scale of projects that are needed. So with all of that, Symbiosis was really formed to encompass these four components. One, an action-oriented offtake commitment, that demand signal that I mentioned before to give that certainty of demand. Two, clarity around what good looks like through unified quality criteria that draws on the latest science and standards. Three, a joint RFP, centralizing the diligence process and the procurement process to help those bandwidth constrained procurement teams, sharing lessons learned to go faster and streamlining the process for developers as well. And for market development, sharing lessons learned so that more buyers, more investors, and more developers can be empowered to act. We launched our first RFP at the end of 2024 and grew our initial project pipeline for reforestation and agroforestry projects. We reviewed 185 projects from over 39 different countries. 52 of those projects went through intermediate diligence. We announced our first Symbiosis project last year with Mombac's project in Brazil, with expecting more offtakes to be announced soon. And our next RFP we'll be announcing next week. We'll cover not just reforestation and agroforestry projects, but also mangroves. When we look for projects, we're looking for offtake-ready projects that combine quality, so high integrity, with commercial readiness. What does that mean? We're looking for projects that design with integrity, so they're aligned with the Symbiosis quality criteria, which I'll go into more detail on shortly. They're tailored to the specific project context, the geographic location, its specific economic context, ecological context, social context. We're looking for a robust operational planning and implementation, the makeup of the team, its resourcing and capitalization, or line of sight to capitalization, and also a sufficient proof of concept. the pilot that it's showing that it actually can demonstrate that it can implement and has the ability to scale. So when we talk about quality, we're really focused on how can we be sure that the projects that we're supporting have real, additional, and durable climate impact. So we aim to create a positive feedback loop to drive high integrity projects, creating a clear quality standard that enables developers to know what do buyers want to buy and that those standards reflect the latest science. So we take that latest science data and best practice to inform quality criteria where we work with experts such as our technical advisory board and experts across the market from NGOs, academics, private sector. That quality criteria then informs our project evaluation, which then informs the portfolio of projects that Symbiosis selects. We aim to share lessons learned from those projects over time, which will feed back into the market, back into to inform research, best practice data, and standards, creating that positive feedback loop. Our technical advisory board was formed last year and represents and has people from leading institutions from across academia and NGOs, such as Johns Hopkins University, the Nature Conservancy, Yale University, University of Cambridge. These are interdisciplinary experts whose expertise spans ecology, climate science, and socioeconomics to enable us to understand how can we know that we're incorporating the latest science as it evolves into our standards. How we define quality is based on 5 key pillars. First is conservative accounting, so making sure that projects make conservative assumptions and incorporate the latest data and science to inform things like leakage assumptions, the carbon accounting itself, baselining, additionality. Durability is our next pillar, so making sure that projects are designed to last and that if and when there's reversal, that is monitored and compensated for. The third pillar is social and community benefits. We want to ensure that communities are engaged equitably from design all the way through implementation, that these projects have ecological integrity, and that there's transparency, that these projects can be evaluated by third parties to understand are they actually having their intended impact. Our quality criteria, which are informed by those quality pillars, touch on all of those pillars and they guide our specific project evaluation. We want to make sure that we're not recreating the wheel, but building on other market efforts and to standardize quality guidance across the market. So these build on the ICBCM's core carbon principles and align with leading market labels such as the CCB labels, SD Vista, and the Abacus label. We incorporate market-leading approaches, and we'll talk more about that in the panel, such as dynamic baselines, conservative leakage assumptions, including requirements around stakeholder engagement. And they're designed to be broad enough to apply across project contexts, but stay consistent through time. So we're aiming to provide that stability that developers need to develop projects and make commitments, but at the same time, ensure that we're reflecting the science as it advances. And so we're trying to do that both by incorporating that into RFP guidance materials that enable us to get more specific and more tailored to specific project contexts and more updated more frequently, but try to keep these quality criteria consistent and only really update them if, as and when there are significant updates in the future. So we did recently update the quality criteria to include mangroves, laying the foundation for our mangrove RFP. We also made some updates based on learnings from our first RFP and from the expansion to other project types. One, we designed them to apply across ecosystems. So recognizing that the things that are necessary for high integrity projects in terrestrial systems often apply in coastal ecosystems as well. So we've made sure that we can call out those specific nuances. We want to reflect the pillars as interconnected co-drivers of impact rather than co-benefits. So you'll see on the right-hand of the slide that for each of the quality criterion, such as leakage, reversal risk estimation mitigation, ecological design of project activities, we highlight where are these contributing to multiple different pillars. So for example, with ecological design of project activities, we want to make sure that not only contributes to durability, that these are resilient systems that we're restoring, but also that they benefit the local communities, because that's when these projects will actually last and have that tangible, durable climate impact that we're looking for. And finally, we incorporated clarifications or more detail, integrating feedback from developers that we heard where people wanted more specificity and to reflect evolving practice. So, for example, we included improved guidance on quantification in project and control plots and in key carbon pools of above ground and soil organic carbon as well. So to come up with these updated quality criteria, we worked with experts, not just on our technical advisory board of independent experts that I shared earlier, but we spoke with and incorporated feedback from experts from the Nature Conservancy, Conservation International, B0, Silvera, Helix Global, UC Berkeley, Yale University, different actors across the ecosystem to ensure we're reflecting a broad variety of views and perspectives to ensure we're capturing what are the latest science and standards. Up above, you see sort of the things that are underpin the quality criteria regardless of ecosystem type. So dynamic baselining, a leakage mitigation hierarchy, which says we want to first eliminate leakage, and where we can eliminate leakage, make sure that we're mitigating any leakage and having conservative assumptions around that leakage. We're quantifying and mitigating reversal risks with long-term management plans in place for durability, providing evidence of land tenure status, having requirements around financial transparency to understand where are benefits being shared, how are the benefits flowing to local communities, ensuring that we have social and environmental safeguards in place by aligning with CCB and SD Vista, and then also ensuring that interventions are ecologically appropriate. So these are just a sampling of the quality criteria. We'll get into more detail in the panel. But really the highlights of differentiation for these two are that for reforestation and agroforestry, we've not changed this, basing our work on the abacus label principles. But we also now include a specification on estimates for above ground biomass and how those should be measured based on in situ data. And then for mangrove, we point specifically to the high quality blue carbon principles and guidance, talk about sort of a restoration hierarchy, if you will, having natural assisted regeneration before direct planting. How do you measure biomass, soil organic carbon, allogenous carbon, and model other emissions? And then we explicitly include sea level rise risk as well when it comes to reversal risk. So Symbiosis will continue to evolve its approach to quality as needed. We want to make sure that we're transparently sharing lessons learned along the way. We are committed to an annual review of our quality criteria, our diligence approach, and guidance to continually reflect the latest lessons and evidence. This updated quality criteria is an example of us making good on that annual review and updates. We have our independent technical advisory board to guide the coalition and our members. We have our RFP diligence conducted by in-house technical as well as third-party experts, incorporating the latest evidence data sets and geospatial tools. We also are dedicated to collaborating with market-wide efforts to share what we're learning and learn from those efforts as well, such as the Yale and the Nature Conservancy Shift CM group that works with the ICVCM as well to advance consistent and updated standards throughout the market. So as before we wrap up and go into the panel, which should be the most fun and interesting part of this whole webinar, I want to just briefly touch on the upcoming RFP and what to expect. So we want to make sure that we're not just talking about quality, but we're actually supporting projects that are doing this in practice. So with this next RFP, this will be open to offtake-ready projects around the world with potential for pre-purchase and mangroves specifically. We're looking for projects with a minimum volume of 100,000 tons, but we'll prefer or prioritize projects that can deliver at least 500,000 tons over 10 years. We're looking for ICVCM approved standards, recognizing that for mangroves, this may not apply to methodologies yet, but it does apply to the standards themselves. These will need to have dynamic baselines as well as a pilot completed. And we'll be sharing more specific guidance on the eligibility for projects in upcoming webinars that we'll be posting soon, so stay tuned. Webinars specific to project developers to really understand what we're looking for in proposals and dig into some of the guidance that we'll share. We've heard feedback from developers from our first RFP, so we are making updates to this next one, including a rolling RFP and continuing a multi-stage diligence process to help to reduce developer burden. This will include a geospatial analysis and a site visit for projects that reach the latest stages. And we'll be publishing guidance and adding to a library of resources on our website. So stay tuned for that. Also, just want to mention that if you are a project that is wondering whether you're going to be eligible for the next RFP, once next RFP opens and the platform opens, you will be able to take a quick project eligibility assessment to help you understand whether it's the right time to apply now or whether it would be best if you would apply in the future. So with that, excited to dig in to our webinar and introduce Susan Cook-Patton, a technical advisory board member for Symbiosis and lead reforestation scientist at the Nature Conservancy, Lola Fatoyinbo, another technical advisory board member for Symbiosis, a visiting scholar at MIT, Reilly O'Hara at Google, and Symbiosis member, and Paolo Quadri, technical lead at Symbiosis Coalition, and for our conversation today. And so let me spotlight all of our speakers here. All right. So to get started, I just want to first say it's great to have a group of folks who represent different perspectives in the market. So we have Reilly and from Google as a buyer, Paolo actually doing the diligence on the Symbiosis side and trying to translate the science into project evaluation and seeing these projects firsthand. Lola and Susan, who have experience with these projects, and from mangroves for Lola, Susan on the reforestation side, scientists who are really trying to make sure that the science that you're doing is actually reflected in practice. So I'm delighted to be joined by you all today. First, I'll start with Reilly and start from the buyer's perspective. We want to make sure that we're driving demand for these projects to help them get the investment that they need. So I'm curious from Google's perspective, as part of Symbiosis, how do you think about high integrity? What does that mean? And why is it important to Google?
Yeah, thanks, Julia. Good to see everyone as well. So I'm Reilly. I lead Google's carbon removal buying. And maybe I'll quickly just say, sort of step back and say the goals of our program. So our team's responsible for finding the right tools in the toolkit that mitigate Google's remaining emissions, but in a way that fundamentally most helps the planet. So how can we use our portfolio of projects and project types to unlock the right set of tools for 2040, 2050, 2080 for removing as much carbon from the atmosphere as possible? When we think about integrity, I think integrity is maybe one of those words that means a lot and carries a lot of weight of projects, but maybe varies in how people think about sort of the different pillars of what constitutes something that's high integrity. So what we try to really think about when we look at what's the best stuff we can fund is try to just be ruthlessly simple about what we're hoping to do and what we really need to see in a given pathway or a given project. And that really comes down to two things. It comes down to projects that have certainty of climate impact and things that have the right scale for climate impact. On the scale side, it's relatively straightforward. It's can volumes go up and costs come down in a way that makes this something that can actually have a dent in climate change in the long run. And on the certainty side, I think that's actually where most people situate in their mind this idea of integrity. So certainty for us comes down to a few things. It comes down to, the question of fundamentally, did the impact actually happen? Was the ton that we're claiming was removed actually removed? It's also that the ton we're saying was removed actually equals a ton. So it's trying to interrogate not only that the impact happened, but that it equals what we say it did and isn't undercut by things like leakage or other risks. We also want to know how long this ton stays out of the atmosphere. So what's the durability? Not necessarily to find some arbitrary threshold, but just knowing that whatever we're saying we've removed, we have a good sense of the length of time that it's actually been removed. And the last thing on the certainty side is that this would not have happened but for our actions, right? So the classic additionality screen. So really, that the impact happened, that the ton equals a ton, that we know how long it's kept out of the atmosphere, and we know it wouldn't have happened without us. So the things really driving our conviction around a climate impact being certain, and then bubbling up to something that we can call high integrity. We're going to hear a lot about specific, very, very advanced and evolving measurement techniques in the rest of this conversation. So maybe as other folks far more qualified head into that world of figuring out the right tools, methods, practices for ensuring that there is high certainty of climate impact, maybe I'll just end by saying that fundamentally for us, I think we try to see integrity not just as, something that exists today and is true today that we never have to think about again, but instead as something that is truly constantly evolving. Science and technology is changing all the time. And 20 years ago, we were thinking somewhat different things about how to accurately quantify, how to achieve that bar of certainty, and how to achieve certain pathways that were scalable. In 20 years from now, likely that technology set or those practices have changed. And rather than seeing that as a risk or something to be afraid of, I think we're really trying to orient ourselves around seeing that as a feature of high integrity projects. That yes, we're doing something today, but with the expectation that better practices, more high fidelity practices, more scalable practices, more precise practices will emerge over time, and that we should not be fearful of those changes, but be really excited to incorporate more novel ways of measuring, even if that has an impact on what we thought was true today or what we thought was true 10 years ago. So yes, integrity is a lot of things that we're doing today, but we should fundamentally understand that those things can and should change over time, and that evolution is really a good thing, and we should be quite excited for it.
Thanks so much, Reilly. And I think I love that approach in that we know enough to act now, today. We know that we need to be doing all of these efforts for nature restoration, protection, engineered a variety of different approaches in order to solve the climate challenge. But we know we're going to learn as we go. So, how can we act smart today, take conservative approaches, integrate the latest science, but know that we're going to learn over time, and expect that is part of making an impact is learning and incorporating that learning as we go. So to that end, Susan and Lola, you've been in seeing the science evolve over time, and I would love to hear your thoughts on how has the science of reforestation, Susan, on your side, and Lola on mangroves in particular, evolved in the last 5 years? That's a very broad ask, but in terms of how you've seen that now reflected in greater confidence in carbon projects and how carbon projects are being done. So maybe Susan, I'll start with you.
Sure, yes. So when I was brought on 10 years ago now at the Nature Conservancy, we had a bar that represented the overall mitigation potential from reforestation. It was a very big bar, and it had massive uncertainty around it that was even bigger than the bar itself. And so for the last 10 years, a lot of my work has been focused on really honing our understanding of the places and the actions that are going to give us the biggest carbon returns per hectare of investment. And through that process, sort of the bar has shrunk, right? The overall global mitigation potential that we think is possible from reforestation has gotten smaller. But to sort of build on Reilly's point, like that's a good thing, right? Like we can't do reforestation everywhere, and really trying to find the places where we have much greater confidence in the amount of carbon that we're going to get and the types of actions that are going to make sense, and we know they're going to be climate positive. That certainty has really grown. Um, and that's great because we don't have enough time and resources to do everything. And so we can help invest in the places where we have the greatest confidence in our outcomes.
Can you give us specific examples, Susan, of certain like of a science or um, scientific advancement that's really helped to narrow those error bars?
Sure, this will get a little nerdy, but hopefully the crowd can hang with me. So albedo is the amount of sunlight that comes in and is either retained within the system or bounced back into space. And trees in particular are dark and they replace, for example, lighter ground covers like grass. And so what happens if you've ever been outside on a sunny day in a hot shirt, a black shirt, you know that you get hotter, right? Like the heat is retained from the sunlight is retained within the system. And this happens with forests too. And people knew that albedo was a problem, but there weren't tools that made it possible to try to deal with albedo in project planning. And so we created a map that showed the places where actually, if you put forest, you're going to have negative outcomes for the climate because that warming that comes from the heat retained within the forest is going to outweigh any of the cooling benefit that you get from sucking carbon out of the atmosphere. And so this has become a tool that is now available, and I've been delighted to see Symbiosis take it into their planning purposes of like, okay, let's concentrate our focus on the places that we think are going to be more likely to be net climate positive after accounting for albedo.
Awesome. A great example, and one where we're trying to stay up to date with the latest science as it evolves, and incorporate that into the work that we're doing. Lola, over to you for mangroves. What's changed in the last 5 years, and what do you think's given greater confidence for mangrove measurement and quantification and carbon projects?
Sure. Yeah, I think one of the things that has really changed in terms of doing mangrove restoration and reforestation is the shift from really focusing on active planting to focusing on restoration of the ecosystems. And I think this kind of goes into also what Susan said, is that we now have a better understanding of what actually works in terms of restoration, in terms of carbon projects for mangroves. So there may be smaller areas or less areas that are actually available for successful projects, but this gives us the understanding that and a better confidence that those projects will actually be successful and sustainable and um, removing carbon for an extended period of time. And I think this is really important also going back to something that Susan mentioned earlier in terms of just knowing where we can do restoration and reforestation in general. The maps that we have for this, both for mangroves and for terrestrial forests, have gotten much better over time, especially in the past few years. And even though you may end up with, in some areas, a smaller area of where you can do this successful restoration, because it's so much certain, I think these projects have a much better chance of being successful, which also means that in general, we have a much higher confidence in the actual science of carbon credits and offsets, which I think is really, really important.
Yeah, absolutely. We want to make sure that if people are spending climate dollars, that it's going to climate impact. And so being able to have certainty and confidence in that impact is critical. Paolo, one question that we heard and collected ahead of time was on dynamic baselines. That's been a big development in the carbon market recently, and giving confidence to buyers, to developers, to investors that projects are actually having additional climate impact. And so I'm curious, why does Symbiosis require these? Could you sort of explain the benefit of dynamic baselines in particular, and what defines a robust dynamic baseline?
Yeah, thank you, Julia, and hi everyone. Good to see you. I mean, I can't really see you, but good to know that you're there. Um, yeah, so dynamic baselines using statistically matched control plots, because that's the real innovation in the past few years, are currently the most cost-effective tool available for assessing the true impact and additionality of a nature-based project. I mean, I think that that's clear. They're not perfect, though. Obviously, they're not perfect tools, and sometimes they're challenging to implement, but they're more scientifically defensible than any previous baselining method, and they're becoming more accessible, right? Like that's one of the things, and I know Susan or Lola can speak more to that, but there are many different innovations, both on the remote sensing side, but also on how we design them. And I think methodologies will continue to incorporate those innovations. For Symbiosis, require them uh, uh, market wide isn't just about the individual quality of a project, but it's about building the kind of trust that the whole market really needs to function at scale. Um, what makes them robust and sound? I would say that three main things. One is measurement accuracy or sensitivity. So when we talk about the stocking index and a remote sensing approach, that needs to be sensitive or appropriate enough to detect real project impact at the margins, so in the details, not just big changes in biomass gains or losses, events that would be obvious, with other methods. If your stocking index is too coarse or not adequate to the ecosystem, then you risk missing the true project impact or contribution. Um, and so that is a big challenge. The second one would be having non-biased representation of the landscape. So the control areas, we really want to see that they really mirror the project area across relevant covariates that are driving carbon accumulation and land use pressure. And the matching quality needs to be formally verified, right, through an overlap metric like the Jakarta Index or propensity score matching distributions. And so that is also very important. There needs to be representation of the landscape and good stratification of your different areas of a project. And then the third one I would say is like I'm superseding the or not superseding, but it's credible ground truth additionality. So to Riley's point earlier, this is the one that I would urge most everyone to take seriously is that you need to demonstrate the counterfactual, the suppressor of carbon or the driver of degradation to the specific land that you're enrolling as part of your project, right? So in that is actual requires local knowledge of in the field, ecological and social knowledge of an area. Remote sensing is a very powerful tool, but all the data in the world cannot substitute for someone who understands why that particular land is under pressure, who are the actors, what are the economic drivers of land use change, how you tackle that. If that local knowledge is not there, the baseline is fragile, regardless of how sophisticated your other tools are. So yeah, I would say those three things are the most important ones, right? So measurement accuracy, non-biased landscape representation, and then credible local knowledge for additionality.
Thanks, Paolo. And building on that point, you brought up remote sensing, which many people, when they think about advancements in the carbon market, advancements particularly around nature-based carbon removal and nature-based solutions, refer to the advent of the use of satellite remote sensing to measure impact, to monitor projects over time. Lola, you are our resident remote sensing expert on the technical advisory board. Bringing decades of experience from NASA and elsewhere. I'm curious to get your take and maybe speak, what are the sort of promises but actual limitations of remote sensing? And if you could specifically talk about mangroves, like the sort of a nuance for a mangroves versus reforestation and agroforestry and terrestrial systems.
Yes, sure. And I really liked what Paulo just said right there, which is that remote sensing is a tool and it's a tool to use, but you still need to know what is happening on the ground, even with the best remote sensing data, you still need to have some local knowledge of what the drivers are, what it is that you're seeing in your data. Um, I think one of the really important points when you're working with remote sensing data, which could be both maps that are derived from remote sensing data or actual satellite imagery or satellite data, is to understand what the objective is that you're trying to achieve. Like, what question are you trying to answer? What do you need this data for? Because depending on what it is that you're trying to achieve with that data, you would use a different type of product. So for example, if you are working in a really, really large area and you're trying to evaluate what the historic loss rates are, what the historic drivers were, you want to make sure that you're working with a type of satellite imagery or type of data or maps that actually have information that goes back into the past long enough for you to establish whatever your baselines are or your loss rates. So if you're working with, let's say, we always have new sensors coming out. If you're working with a relatively new sensor, even if it's really high quality, if you don't have historic imagery to compare it to, then that will complicate your kind of your certainty or the quality of your data set. I would like to say, for example, with sensors like Landsat or Sentinel-2 that come out of NASA and the European Space Agency, because these have such a long history in terms of collecting data on a regular basis in the past, that's a really good data set to establish your baselines or to understand how your system has changed. It's also a really high quality data set because of the way that that the space agencies are make sure that you can actually compare the data, that you'll have really that they're actual measurements and not just images. So if you're looking at change, for example, you might want to use a data set that has really high quality long-term data. If you're trying to estimate if you're trying to look at monitoring your project and how after you've had your intervention, you're doing your planting, you want to continue monitoring that over time. Um, that's where you might be more interested in using really higher resolution imagery, because then you can actually see more on the ground and detect your intervention earlier because your data is just of higher resolution, and so you can see smaller features on the ground. But then, of course, that also comes with a cost because a lot of the high resolution imagery is actual commercial and you have to purchase it. Um, Similarly, you might be interested in using drone data to monitor your project, but the drone data will give you really high quality imagery. But again, because you're actually flying your own drone, the area that you can cover is much more limited. And in some ways, the drone data could even be compared to getting in situ or field measurements on the ground. So I think what's really important, again, is to understand what it is that you're trying to achieve with your satellite imagery and your remote sensing data. And then when it comes to mangroves, I think one of the um, benefits that mangroves have, which is also a challenge, is that they're really challenging to work in. It's really challenging to work in a mangrove. There is a, a lot, I think, from a field data perspective, collecting in situ data in mangroves is really challenging. And so remote sensing data is really, really useful in this case to uh, be able to scale up from your field measurements to remote sensing data. Um, we also have been working really hard on producing very high quality data sets of canopy height and carbon stocks in mangroves. And one of the reasons why we are more confident or very confident in the biomass maps that are produced, or the carbon estimates that we can produce from a mangrove in mangrove ecosystems, is also because these systems are, generally speaking, much more homogeneous than other terrestrial forests. You have a smaller number of species. For example, on the Atlantic coast, we usually only have 4 species of mangrove. So it's much easier to derive a generalized kind of model that goes from field data to remote sensing data and scale that up with certainty.
Thanks for that, Lola. Paolo or Susan, do you want to sort of jump in there at all? And Paolo, maybe on the, acknowledging that projects that apply to symbiosis may have different project types, different scales. Like what are maybe a little bit of guidance for developers or others as they're thinking about what's the appropriate remote sensing tools to use?
I'll just add that we have live science going right now, where what we've noticed, as Lola said, field data can be very hard, very laborious, time intensive, hard to have good, like wall to wall maps, of course, with field data. So remote sensing data offers a lot of advantages, but what we found is that different data providers, publicly available biomass maps, field data, you put it all together for the same project, and we at this point are getting different results. And so I think to emphasize what Reilly was saying before, like this is such a dynamic space where there is so much rapid learning, and I'm quite confident that we will crack this nut, um, and be better able to leverage remote sensing data going forward. But I do think this is one of those science frontiers to figure out, like, why do the estimates vary? And can we explain that variation and figure out what is the best approach for the best context? But I don't have the answer yet, but there's a bunch of people working on it, so I'm confident we'll get there soon.
And we think about with symbiosis, and turn over to Paolo, is really thinking about how do we make sure that people are using the best available data, and then the sort of taking a conservative assumptions, right? And acting in a conservative way, because that gives us the confidence to act now, knowing that the outcome may be different, but if we've made conservative assumptions, that gives us the confidence to support projects now. Paolo, anything else to add on that?
Yeah, I would just quickly, and also I'm looking at the chat a little bit because I think there's a concern that is legitimate about, science can move fast, and then issuance remain static. You generate issuance in the past, and then the science has changed. But I think this is a good example of how that doesn't necessarily undermine the market, right? Like the fact that we are learning more and more. I think that I would encourage you to developers to, before when in the stages of design of a project, to actually work together with experts that can be local experts, universities, or experts like Lola and Susan themselves, to figure out, okay, what is the best product that I can use it? What is the best like data fusion technique that it's the most, that as far as we know right now, is going to be the most appropriate one and that will probably be, is there a sufficient locally calibrated product that can help you with your baseline design, or with what kind of sensors are you using? And then also ensuring that the dynamic baselines, the way they are right now by methodologies, are going to change in that, and I think that's good, and they should be changing based on the feedback that developers are providing to standards and to ourselves as well. So that should be a living process of feedback, so that we can keep improving them, and that I don't think it's a matter of like having just one way of doing dynamic baselines for all project types, because that can be a bit idiosyncratic, and we need to develop better ways of attending different project contexts. So yeah, but that's I would really index on trying to do the work previously, the research of like what is the best approach for this particular place, and then go from there, right? In 3 years, 4 years from now, after the project was started, maybe a better product comes online, and so you have to tweak something. You kind of walk back some things, and it turns out that you're generating more or less credits than what you expected at the beginning of the project, but you are already in the right path, right? Is that it's about reducing certainty as much as possible.
And again, like when making commitments to deliver a certain quantity of projects of credits to buyers, that's a conversation around, well, then what's the right assumptions to be made to be conservative enough to have
Right.
confidence that you can actually deliver that number of credits, knowing that that's something that's really important to buyers, is not only the integrity of these projects, but that the credits can be delivered on time and in the volumes that they need. So again, that's sort of the necessary approach of using the best available science and resources, knowing that it's not a one size fits all. I think is the main takeaway from Lola and Paolo's points. But making conservative enough assumptions that in the event that we learn over time that things are different than what we expected, that we've made accounted for that in the project design and the assumptions that were made. I guess, Reilly, back to you on that point. How do you think about like what is good enough in these projects?
Oh, great question. In some ways, it's not so much about good enough in the sense of passing some minimum threshold, but instead of trying to shoot for as high quality, catalytic, transformational as possible. Um, just a small point. I think a lot of times people will think around like whether something's good enough in terms of risk, right? So like how risky is this thing we're taking? And in that sense, I think from our perspective, we are much less interested in answering a question like our go no go decision around is this a risky project, and much more interested in is this a good risk or is this a bad risk. So in the case of good risks, one example would be sometimes I would be quite interested in figuring out what trade-offs are taking place. So maybe there's some delivery risk, but is doing this project the strongest signal to a country where you could have 10, 50, 100x the impact in the long run? Then great. I would trade delivery risk over the project I'm funding every single day for the hopes of actually changing something systemic in a given region or in a given project type. And in the case of bad risk, what we try to think about is, okay, if this is the risk that we would like to not see in a project, then what steps do we take to mitigate it? So like what actually then gets into how we evaluate these projects and then what tips it over into the yes category. I'll try to be quick because I'm sure there are a lot of questions that we want to get to and answer. But I think the first one relates back to what I said in the beginning. Can we accurately quantify the impact? At the end of the day, we are buying carbon credits to put against a claim. So accurate quantification is really important because we're claiming something against them. And so we want to know to the best of our ability today that what we're claiming is actually accurate. But when I look at a specific project, it's not just presenting without any in-depth analysis that the impact the ton equals a ton. And it's much more about preferring projects that take uncertainty head on and address it, like you all were saying before, with conservatism and a high level of transparency. I would much rather work with projects that flag where there are uncertainties than those who try to claim that everything is known, everything is perfect, and everything is highly accurate. It's much easier to try to figure out how to manage uncertainty than it is to try to manage inaccuracy. The second, though, thing that we'd look for is the implementation of this project actually feasible, right? So if I'm evaluating a project, the things I'm looking at are fairly well known in diligence, right? So like, can this counterparty or this project developer actually deliver? Do they have the operational expertise? Do they have a track record? Do they have financing to back up the work that they're doing? Have they designed the project well? Do they have the right people on board to navigate changing landscapes, whether that's political or geographical or measurement? But at the same time, I think feasible implementation also goes into their ability to set up a project and manage not just their own like legal contracts, but the social contracts in the communities that they're working in. So especially true for things like durability, where often their ability to deliver something that persists over time has a legal element, but it very much has a social element as well. How have they brought in communities? How are they engaging them? How are they ensuring that the impact that they're having is robust over time, such that it will persist for longer than it otherwise would if it's just bound to the contract? And the last thing we look for is, are we truly catalyzing something? So this goes back to the first thing I said, which was we want to use our portfolio to find the right toolkit for the planet. So yes, we're buying tons, but what we really want to buy is a learning curve. And what we really want to buy is the ability to deliver more volume at a lower price while ensuring really high certainty of impact. So we hope to catalyze things that show the best way to do things in a given region. Maybe it's a way to measure, maybe it's a way to implement, maybe it's a way to structure agreements on the ground. We want to find projects that are highly open source so that others can learn from them, freely share their uncertainties, their learnings, their evolution, so that it's easier for the next group. And then the last thing is we want to find projects that are actually changing policy and regulation on the ground, such that there is some ability to connect this sort of cluster of demand called the voluntary carbon market to what should be a much larger cluster of demand and financing for this type of work that will come from governments, that will come from regulation, that will come from industry. And so as much as we can find the projects that don't just start and end with the impact they're having, but fundamentally transform the ability to finance and develop and implement these things beyond just the voluntary carbon market, that's a core piece.
Thanks for that, Reilly. Well said, and really reflects a lot of the symbiosis approach as well. And I'll go to questions from the audience next. So if you haven't yet put questions in the chat, put them in now. There's a bunch in there. For the questions that are super specific to the RFP, I will not be reading those questions out now, but we'll take those questions down so that we can address those in future webinars that we'll have one for reforestation and agroforestry projects specifically, and one for mangrove projects specifically, where we can address specifically your questions that are really specific to RFP submissions. So we will not forget about you. We'll take these questions down and make sure that we tailor our upcoming webinars to address those. But before we turn to questions, Paolo, last question to you. I guess I wanted to just hear briefly on how does Symbiosis think about translating the quality criteria to specific project evaluation? How do we do that in a way that takes into account the nuance of each given project?
Yeah, thanks, Julia. Good question. So, the quality criteria are intentionally high level because nature-based projects are complex and somewhat idiosyncratic, as you're saying. And being overly prescriptive at this criteria level, I think, would do more harm than good. But high-level guidance doesn't mean lose diligence, right? It means you need a rigorous framework of how to apply that guidance to specific project context. Our approach is built around mitigation likelihood gradient. I'll explain what that means a little bit. that runs from sort of like foundational risks, so the ones that are largely or nearly impossible to mitigate once identified, so non-mutable, down to implementation and design choices that are more correctable and treatable, right, once you are engaging with the project. We sequenced our questions and analytical efforts accordingly. So foundational and structural questions come first, because discovering a critical gap at that level late in the process sort of just waste times for everyone. In terms of tools that we use, so the readiness checklist, for example, which we will discuss at a later webinar soon, which maps or helps us map required documentation to specific quality criteria and explains why each piece of documentation is required. Developers can use this as a working tool rather than just sort of like a compliance checklist or like a submission checklist. And then we have internal diligence frameworks that help us structure process and sequence of our evaluation and sort of like those fundamental contextual questions to the technical design choices. I just want to provide a quick example so that this doesn't stay kind of like, up in the stratosphere. So leakage is a good example. For example, we start with context, right? What are the land use and economic dynamics and history of this particular landscape? This is in background information. It is the foundation of a project, right? Like where you choose to work is the most foundational thing possible. From there, we ask, are the proposed project's activities appropriate for this context? For instance, is a project attempting to restore full canopy native forests in areas that are moderately productive agriculturally and sort of like economically active? If so, then leakage risk is elevated, and that's not a documentation problem that you can fix later, right? Or like a factor that you can adjust. The intervention design may need to change, but by that time, we are reviewing it and it might be too late. So only after we evaluate that, after understanding that context, then or foundation, then we evaluate the leakage mitigation plan. If it's feasible and robust enough given the landscape dynamics, is production being relocated to more appropriate areas, and if this is a credible dynamic and for managing displacement pressure. And last, and in this case, not first, we look at the leakage deduction factor. The reason it comes last is that there isn't really sufficient empirical data to reliable anchor, like what's appropriate and from a deduction necessarily for any given context. So we can use that deduction factor as a substitute for understanding all these foundational dynamics. I mean, we look at it and depending on all those other aspects, then we decide, okay, is this conservative enough or not? But the sequencing really matters. Yeah.
And that's helpful. And I actually purposely asked that question too, because there were a number of questions in the chat around, how do you think about flexibility for different contexts? How do you think about looking at projects with different standards or different methodologies? So really what you're explaining, Paolo, is that we're looking at what are these fundamental risks, project design elements, and then how are the adaptation and management plans designed? How is the project designed tailored to that particular project context? While checking the boxes that are needed for any particular methodology so that we know that this is really a robust, appropriately designed project that meets the symbiosis quality criteria, regardless of the methodology that's used.
Right. That's correct. And just one super quick clarification for context is that in Symbiosis, we are looking at projects that, for the most part, are just starting, right? So we're trying to make predictions about the future as opposed to looking back into a project that has been operating already. So, this is why we follow this approach partly.
Or that, we'll be looking for projects that have pilots that have been implemented, but they're
Sure.
pilots that intend to be scaled up many, many
Right.
times. So it
Exactly.
really is just at the beginning of these
Yeah.
projects' life cycles. And so to your point, Paolo, we can't look back and see how did it do, but we're trying to make our best assessment of how we think it will and whether it's likely to meet the quality criteria and whether it's likely to have the impact that it intends to. So question for Reilly. How has Symbiosis changed the nature-based carbon removal market in your view? How has it?
Um, I think maybe one of the goals of Symbiosis was to figure out how we could align the market around robust quality requirements, standards, and practices. And then, like we've been talking about for most of today, figure out the best way to actually change those over time as science and practice evolves. So I think we've done that first part ideally by just coming out with quality pillars for these different pathways, by bringing in folks like Lola and Susan to help us unpack what good looks like, help us communicate that out to the market. So I think, like, goal one, hopefully checked. And I think from the RFPs, we're really seeing that bear out in the projects that are coming across our desks too, which is super exciting to see. And then I think moving forward, it will really just be about how do we update that over time in a way that continues to be highly transparent while remaining conservative, while evolving with new practices. It's going to be a fun few needles to thread. But I think very much everyone is committed to figuring out how we use the quality pillars as the starting point, but then continue to iterate as we learn more over time. So, I mean, you can let us know, folks, how we're doing, and I'm sure many people already are. But I think we've already started in a pretty good spot of figuring out what good should look like, and then going out and putting dollars behind those beliefs.
Thanks, Reilly. Yes, and we're thrilled to work with others in the ecosystem, from standards to other project developers, investors, scientists, other market actors, to really collectively move the needle together and try to bring more clarity to this market that's so critical for driving finance at scale for nature. Um, we sort of touched on this question before, but if there are any further reflections, I want to make sure that we speak to this, because it is an interesting dynamic in the market where we want to instill trust and confidence by relying on the latest science and standards, but acknowledging that those will continue to evolve, and that developers, communities are designing in one context, and how do they and making commitments on one context. How do you balance that tension? And so, any thoughts? We talked about conservatism. We've talked about transparency, and I think a learning mindset in general to say, like, this is that a narrative that we need to shape collectively, externally as well, to support these projects, and the work that the companies and others are doing to drive impact. But I'm curious if there are any sort of other reflections on how do we mitigate these risks for projects.
Well, I, I can jump, but I don't want to. I don't, I don't want to take that. Um, no, I mean, I think risk mitigation, and I really want to underline what Riley said earlier about, at, especially at the stage that we as Symbiosis are working with projects and diligence. It's much better to understand the uncertainties and because if we can map them, if we can understand the different uncertainties of a project, then we can plan ahead, right? And we can work together, through the diligence process, but also then project developers can more easily receive feedback about what are the things that maybe they're not seeing. And also we understand, in many cases, we as advisors will understand things that are not obvious for us. And so I would just underscore that, like, really being transparent and open about, like, this is something that we don't know, but that we are likely to figure out in the next year or two, right, as we make progress. Because then that allows you to plan what kind of data you need to collect, what kind of information you need to understand to be able to come up with a mitigation plan. Other than that, the only thing that I would add there is that in the conservation space, right, for decades now in natural resource management, parks, so there always been like central management documents to a particular area, to a particular place. And I would encourage, everyone that is developing a project to have that. It's not a PDD necessarily. It's more like, what is the management of this particular region that we are changing now? What are we going to do 5 years, 10 years, 15 years? It's a plan, and plans always change, but it's always so important to have that. And again, to be transparent about, like, what do we know, what do we don't know, and how do we adapt to changes in the future. So those are the things that I would add that help a lot with mitigation of risks.
Well, we're at time. Any closing thoughts, Susan, Lola, Reilly, Paolo? Thank you so much for your time. This is a meaty topic of so many different dimensions of this quality criteria. We could spend an hour, a day on each dimension of the quality criteria for symbiosis. But hopefully this gives you a sense of how we're trying to navigate the complexity, integrate the latest science, operate with, in spite of uncertainty, when we know that the climate needs us to act now and act with urgency, and nature restoration is a critical tool in our toolkit to do so. Any final thoughts, Susan or Lola, Reilly, or
My only final thought is that I just applaud the commitment to learning, that we are just learning so fast and so rapidly at a time when the world needs us to run as fast as we possibly can. And so I just am incredibly grateful for Symbiosis to be so open and transparent and ready to learn. I think that will benefit the whole community.
and excited to announce more offtakes soon to get more projects done. So and more points on the board towards our commitment. So thank you all so much for the time. Thank you for those of you in the audience, and please send questions. We'll note down the questions that we weren't able to ask and try to get to those in other forums. We'll also be at North America Carbon World next week. Our Director of Operations, Ratnika Prasad, will be there. We'll be hosting a developer breakfast. And just thank you so much for your engagement and all the action that you do every day to drive more impact for our planet. So thank you all very much.
Bye all. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.